Good evening, ma'am, and welcome to Hannibal's. Is this your first time with us?
Yes, it is.
We do things a little differently here. We serve people.
But don't all restaurants serve people?
Not the way we do.
Okay, well, tell me about the ravioli.
Excellent choice. His name was Jimmy Ravioli, and he's oven-baked with crispy Yukon Gold potatoes, fava beans, and a nice Chianti.
Do you have anything vegetarian?
Do you mean someone who was a vegetarian? We do have Alan, who was a macrobiotic flexitarian, and we're serving him today with braised fennel and polenta.
Was he free range?
Totally. He was a jogger.
Joggers are tough. I'm not sure that's what I want.
As we say here at Hannibal's, YOLO Atway.
I'm sorry, what's that mean?
You only live once, and then we eat you.
Huh. Well, how much is the jogger?
$26.95.
26? That's outrageous.
Seriously? You're eating at a cannibal restaurant, and you think the prices are outrageous?
All right, that's a fair point. Today on the show, our continuing fascination, revulsion, and occasional amusement with people who eat people. And now he didn't know what to make of the new intern, so he settled on spaghetti sauce. Colin McEnroe.
Okay, it is not true that we eat the interns. We don't even have any interns because we ate them. All right, so we're going to be talking about cannibalism today. We'll talk about it in the real world and in the fictional world. Towards the end of the show, you'll even meet a person who was prosecuted, not for cannibalism, but for fantasizing about cannibalism and talking as if he were maybe just about to engage in cannibalism. Somebody who was prosecuted and then ultimately freed. Anyway, well, that story is to come. So we're going to start in culture, but then we're going to move back into history, back into even the Bible, where cannibalism comes up maybe more often than you think, or than you might think. So let me tell you who's here with us today. Joining us by phone is Bill Schutt, a professor of biology at LIU Post and research associate at the American Museum of Natural History, where they do not have a cannibalism diorama. That was a different show we did anyway. He's the author of Cannibalism, A Perfectly Natural History. And Charles Bramesco, freelance film and TV critic, writer for sites including Rolling Stone, Vanity Fair, and The Verge, and author of the article, We're Living in the Golden Age of On-Screen Cannibalism. He's joining us from the NPR studios in New York City. So, Charles, let's begin with you then. Make the case for the idea that we're living in the golden age of on-screen cannibalism.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's more than just the fact that we're seeing an influx of entertainment featuring cannibals, but it's more a reinterpretation of what that type means, about examining the motives behind cannibalism, the ramifications that it has on the people who practice it, whether, this is a willing process or something that they do against their better judgment, sort of trying to resist it. We're seeing altogether a more nuanced approach to the material, and it's being stretched in a bunch of different tonal directions as well. It's being mined for comedy on Netflix's series, The Santa Clarita Diet, and it's also pervaded the world of art film. There's a fine film called Raw by a director named Julia Ducournau that came out earlier this year about a young girl's coming of age, with cannibalism used almost as a metaphor for the tumultuous urges of adolescence.
And so let's pause with one of those, because I think that there's maybe the fulcrum that we're looking for there. So the Santa Clarita Diet, which I've watched a little bit of, is a black comedy featuring Drew Barrymore and Timothy Olyphant, and they are real estate agents, which I think might actually be significant. But they're real estate agents, and she's developed this thing where she doesn't look like a zombie. She just looks like her normal self, except that she has developed this appetite for human flesh, which she's shown graphically and bloodily consuming. It's like the human flesh eating equivalent of a pie eating contest or something. I mean, she's just got, blood dripping down her chin and all this kind of stuff. And so this is a change, and we'll get to maybe where that we'll see change happen. But Charles, this is a change in the sense that the cannibal isn't depicted as the other, quote, capital T, capital O, right? The cannibal here is a real estate agent who just happens to have gone off the rails in one particular area of her life. And it's funny because obviously it transgresses against this very basic taboo, but it's not funny in a way like, look how completely weird this person is, right? Some of the normalness of her is somehow or other part of the viewpoint of the show.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that's the idea is the comedy comes from the show's willingness to take this material seriously and imagine how a real person, a recognizable person, a friend, a neighbor, and a wife would handle being placed in a situation that is to us fanciful. The show, she at the same time is very drawn to the process of eating flesh. I think it's not gratuitous that they have all, as you say, the blood dripping down the chin, pie-eating caliber feeding frenzies, because that communicates the full intensity of her need to do this. And so you realize that she's not, this other, as you described, she's not so much a monster as much a person like you or me, but a person who's plagued by a desire that she can't control, whether that speaks to addiction, that's a ready analog there, but anyone's familiar with having feelings that they can't control or feelings that they wish, they weren't having. This amplifies those and exaggerates them and takes them to comic, grisly extremes.
All right, so let's hear a little bit from that show. This will be Drew Barrymore as Sheila Hammond, the realtor. She's being rudely hit on by a guy who pays the price for his pushiness. Sheila is going to bite off his fingers and eat them.
How about this? We have some fun. You said you're all about fun, and I don't say anything to your lame husband, or we don't. And I tell him we screwed 4 times last night in my Beamer.
Your unwillingness to take no for an answer has made me feel sexy and desirable. Uh-huh.
I know. Weirdest foreplay ever.
You ate my fingers.
I do not hate your fingers.
Ate my fingers.
All right. I think that's Nathan Fillion as the guy who gets his fingers bitten. So, Bill Shutt, I want to add you to this conversation because I think one of the big departures we're seeing, and it predates this particular moment, as we will discuss. But if you think about the way that popular culture might have depicted a cannibal, say, 50 years ago, and it was particularly true in, say, Warner Brothers Looney Tune cartoons, where there was this kind of crypto-racist, trope almost of white explorers being dropped into this big black cooking pot, and there would be gathered around them African-looking people with bones in their noses and stuff like that. That's what a cannibal was, right? The cannibal was a way of describing a completely alien culture where people did things that we don't do, which, as we'll talk about a little bit more in the second segment, tracks pretty well with the way that we tend to demonize societies or subcultures that we want to dominate in other ways. But this notion, Bill, that the cannibal might be somebody living next door to us, it's a very different kind of depiction and argument about cannibalism. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I certainly think it's a new take on an old theme, and as you said, classically, when you hear the word cannibalism, you have these knee-jerk reactions. And you certainly don't think about the person next door, or a realtor, or somebody that you might sit down to a regular meal with. This is really sort of from what I can tell, it's a new take on this.
So I think we know when the pivot happened, probably, and Charles, it really is the introduction, I would say, of Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs, but he's also in a whole bunch of other things, both precede and come after. I think Brian Cox was the original Hannibal Lecter. But anyways, we see this guy who, far from being this, primitivized being, is like smarter than we are and kind of louche and appealing in certain ways, witty and possessed of a peculiar moral code, but a moral code nonetheless. He can do horrible things to people, but he doesn't like other people doing horrible things to people. So and I guess, Charles, I'm kind of wondering what was going on there. I mean, one argument would be that we just kind of domesticated all of the ghouls, that if you can have a louche, entertaining vampire, you can have a louche, entertaining cannibal, etc.
Yeah, well, I think the longevity of the Hannibal Lecter cycle of films speaks to the enduring appeal of this character, is that at the center is this very beguiling contradiction that he's defined by this act that we consider savage, the eating of flesh, which he often does as frequently in a savage manner as he does in a refined manner. He talks about eating the liver with fava beans and a Chianti, which is an extremely tasteful pairing. But then you see in Red Dragon and in Silence of the Lambs, he's also capable of great violence and great savagery. And so seeing this lifestyle made sort of sophisticated, made almost seductive by the way that Lecter carries himself, he almost wears this taste for flesh as a sign of refinement. And so this character begs the question, what is it that separates a sane person from a cannibal? Is just the willingness to do so. And Hannibal Lecter makes the very troubling suggestion that when you reach a higher plane of morality, that's how he considers himself at least, that the distinction between eating animal flesh and eating human flesh falls away, and it's just a matter of simple taste.
So, Bill Schutt, if our villains and our horror figures are about our anxieties, our anxieties are a little bit different. And I think you can make the same argument with vampires. Vampires used to be Eastern European, and they said things like, listen to them, children of the night. And there was this sense that they existed in this very, once again, capital O, other place. This other place. They weren't us. We're not vampires. They're vampires. And gradually vampires kind of crept into our neighborhoods and began to talk much more like we talk and look much more like we look. And I don't necessarily need to construct some kind of uber cultural theory here right now, but it seems like all of this is more about our notion that we're not comfortable with each other. That the people that we're around are potentially, even if you think about The Walking Dead, ultimately what becomes scary in The Walking Dead is not so much the zombies, but the other people who've survived the zombie apocalypse. They're like worse than any zombie. It's like we're more frightened of each other these days than we are of some weird thing that lives somewhere else.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't. What's the question there? I'm not.
Well, I guess I'm not sure, Bill. I guess, Bill, I'm wondering, does it seem anyway as though we're focusing our anxieties in a different place? But if we make cannibals into someone who is basically, an exaggerated version of our most bullying college professor, are we in fact sort of saying something about where our anxieties are right now?
Yeah, I suppose. As I said, this is sort of a new take on an old theme, and it's innovative, and I think that cannibals and vampires come in and out of style, and there's sort of 20, 30 years ago it was vampires, and all of a sudden they got really sexy, and now you're seeing a slightly different take on cannibalism.
All right, let's hear a little bit from Hannibal. This is from the TV series Hannibal, because people could not get enough Hannibal Lecter. This is Hannibal throwing a dinner party at which he serves a paralyzed colleague. Sorry about this if you're on your lunch hour right now. A paralyzed colleague his own cooked leg, explaining that it's practical use of an otherwise wasted limb. Here we go.
Clay roasted thigh and canoe cut marrow bone. Shall I carve?
I think you already have.
Your legs are no good to you anymore. You've got a T4 fracture of the vertebra. This is a far more practical use for those limbs.
You intend me to be my own Last Supper?
Yes.
How does one politely refuse a dish in circumstances such as these?
One doesn't. The tragedy is not to die, Abel, but to be wasted.
So, Charles Bramesco, is Hannibal also just a little bit, and I haven't seen Raw, I'm not quite sure I'm going to see Raw, but is Hannibal a little bit of just the insufferable foodie as well? This kind of notion that, ultimately there's going to be a food trend for everything?
Yeah, well, I think, at least on the show, that's ultimately Hannibal's undoing, is that he is, very haughty, very, set in his own manners, and that manifests as an arrogance, which eventually, threatens to undo him at all these different points on the show. And so the extent to which that speaks to this real-world culture of, food elitism, however you want to call it, foodieism, there's definitely a lot of that there about food manifesting as a social mark of merit, about almost conspicuous consumption in the most literal sense in what you are consuming. Hannibal isn't on Instagram, but it's not hard to imagine him taking photos of his elaborately prepared dishes to show them off. That's why he always loves having guests over, is because he wants to show how eating food and more specifically the way he prepares it, which is very meticulous, as you hear. He carves. That's a sign that he is superior, at least in his own estimation.
So, Bill, somewhere on Hannibal Lecter's family tree is Norman Bates. Now, we don't see Norman Bates, making human thighs in clay pots. But Norman Bates actually also has a more real-life antecedent, right? Somebody named Ed Gein.
Yeah, that would be Ed Gein, who was a famous murderer and a necrophile back in Wisconsin in 1957. And when Robert Bloch wrote the novella Psycho in 1958, he really sort of downplayed the mutilation and cannibalism, and he concentrated on that mother fixation. And Alfred Hitchcock sent his people out to purchase every book he could find. So when he decided he was going to make that into a movie, he didn't want anyone to know the ending. But yeah, so there is this tie-in between Ed Gein and our anti-hero in Psycho.
The other thing I'm wondering about, Charles, and once again, I haven't seen Raw, which is the new French cannibal film that's making the rounds of festivals and seems to be visceral enough to be inducing various kinds of fainting attacks and vomiting and God knows what else. But it's also the sort of sense that, well, we want to be afraid of something, and people who make scary movies and horrifying movies want to be able to horrify people. And after a while, you've seen zombies do everything that they're going to do, and you've seen vampires in every possible configuration. Is some of this just we're kind of looking around, or creators looking around for something that still will make people swoon?
I think a lot of it is a matter of horror being cyclical. I think that when trends arise and then they peak and then they ebb, and then it falls to writers and directors to sort of move in the other direction. We spoke about vampires and how they were sort of romanticized near the tail end of the 2000s and the 2010s with Twilight and everything. And so then vampires are primed for sort of a return to their monstrous origins more than the way they've been domesticated. And I think the same goes for cannibals, is that after all these years of considering them as barbarians, returning them to a sort of civility is to us very chilling right now. But I think as soon as audiences start to recognize that as the norm, it'll be a very smart filmmaker who realizes the time to go in the opposite direction has come and brings someone who is not recognizable to us, who is almost frightening in how unrecognizable they are. So Charles, while we're on this topic, we've named a few of these things. There's another movie called The Bad Batch. I actually, first of all, should say that I found, just looking around, I found that Trey Parker was involved in a movie called Cannibal the Musical, which predates things like the Book of Mormon. It's basically a Donner Party type of musical, which only somebody from South Park would probably think of to do. So tell us about The Bad Batch. Is this a new film or one in the recent past? This is an upcoming film. It's coming out this summer, I think, August, I believe, or maybe late July. But I managed to catch this at the Toronto Film Festival back in September. And cannibalism does take a sort of central role in that film as well. It focuses on a dystopian society near the Texas-Mexico border where undesirable figures are sort of deposited in this vast, almost desert prison and kind of just left to their own devices. And so this colony called the Bad Batch forms, and these are people who, through virtue of necessity, have begun to eat human flesh as well, which goes back to, among the most notorious cannibals ever were the Donner Party, who were all, they embarked as regular people, but when supplies were scarce and they were on the skids in terms of having food to eat, they were as savage as the situation called for. And then The Bad Batch speaks to that as well in its depiction of cannibalism. It shows that these are people who have adapted as necessary and just incorporated into their lives what they have to do to survive.
So Charles Bromesco, first of all, thank you so much for talking to us. A freelance film and TV critic, writes for sites including Rolling Stone, Vanity Fair, The Verge, and more, author of the article, We're Living in the Golden Age of On-Screen Cannibalism. Definitely read that for other insights. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back. Charles has given us a perfect segue to a longer conversation with Bill Schutt. We're going to talk a little bit about that notion that, yes, one thing that happens is that when normal people have nothing else to eat, guess what they do?
What is that?
It's fop, finest in the shop. And we have some shepherds pie peppered with actual shepherd on top. And I've just begun. Is a politician so oily? Is served with a doily of one.
Put it on a bun. Well, you never know if it's going to run.
Try the fryer, fry the dryer.
No, the clergy is really too coarse and too mealy.
That actor, that's compactor.
Yes, and always arrives overdone.
All right, we're back talking about cannibalism, as only this show can, I think. Or maybe not. Maybe other shows do. Who knows? Terry Gross may have something like this coming up. Bill Schutt is with us right now, professor of biology at LIU Post and research associate at the American Museum of Natural History. He's the author of Cannibalism, A Perfectly Natural History. So, Bill, we're going to talk about places where maybe cannibalism is a little bit more normalized, places in history where it's been intentionally engaged in for various reasons, places on the globe where maybe it's not so weird. But I maybe we should start by putting one fundamental premise on the table and tell me if you disagree. But it just seems like anybody, any group of people, I mean, on the one hand, cannibalism is this terrible taboo, that place where absolutely nobody should go. Jeffrey Dahmer is the most horrible person in the world. He's worse than other serial killers because he ate people. That makes it worse somehow. There's sort of that taboo. But then there's, this understanding, or maybe it's an understanding we don't have, that we're all, 10 years of bad food supply away from eating other people. Every world famine in history is accompanied by documentation, usually, of cannibalism, whether it's China in 1960 after the Great Leap Forward, Russia in 1921, Jamestown, the original European arrivals in America, Ireland during the famine, right? I mean, one reason people eat other people is when there's nothing else to eat.
Yeah, I think that survival cannibalism spans this cultural taboo that we've had in the West probably for around 2,000 years. When there's nothing else to eat, it's not really a matter of choice at a certain point. Your body is, in a sense, cannibalizing itself, and you come to the point where, in this extreme stage of starvation, where you are either going to consume the dead or feed the dead to your kids or to your loved ones, or you're going to perish. And so at that point, the choice is made. It's not something that you can sort of plan out.
So there's that. And then we have to sort of talk a little bit about our own nature, too. So keeping in mind, Bill, that I've done my 23andMe profile, and I have more Neanderthal DNA than 72% of the population, and I'm very sensitive about microaggression. There's this notion that maybe one of the places we get this whole cannibal thing is from our Neanderthal forebears. Where do you come down on that one?
Yeah, I don't think that that's the case. I think that before we had, I believe that ancient humans cannibalized when necessary. It might have been part of their culture once that started to develop. It might have been a funerary rite. It might have been a way to deal with your enemy after you killed him. But I don't believe that it's something that was necessarily passed down by the Neanderthals. There is evidence in several different ancient human societies that cannibalism took place, whether it was cannibalism because of a lack of food, or whether it had some other, whether it was culinary cannibalism. I don't think that a lot of these folks back then were worried about Western taboos because they didn't exist yet. So when you had meat in front of you, whether it was human or from something that you killed, these types of questions probably didn't come to mind. It was just a matter of, well, there's this meat. What are we going to do with it? And often I imagine it was eaten.
Actually, in my Neanderthal family, there's a joke that was passed down for generations. It was like when a Neanderthal says, "You don't like your mother-in-law? Just eat the noodles." All right, so we have to talk about the Bible. You don't think about the Bible as a place where there's a lot of cannibalism talk, but in a way you'd be wrong. I mean, particularly we'll come to communion in a second, but in the New Testament, there's mostly, I would sort of say, talk in the form of admonition more than, hey, you're a bunch of cannibals.
Yeah, there are really two things going on in the Bible, and one is, as you mentioned before, transubstantiation, when you talk about communion. But the other is your basic siege cannibalism, where you have the cities of Jerusalem and Samaria that are surrounded. There's no food, and now there are descriptions of possible cannibalism occurring within these cities.
Right, but it's usually one of the prophets or the voice of God saying, if you don't change your ways, repent, whatever, this is what's going to happen.
Right.
So, it really is kind of held up as a very undesirable outcome.
Absolutely.
And it's a warning, and you have an opportunity to divert your life's course so that you avoid that particular eventuality. Okay, so then we get into the New Testament. We have the complex notion of transubstantiation, which is the argument that the wafer and the blood are not simply symbols, but in fact true manifestations of the flesh and blood of Christ. Anecdotally, it's been even said that missionaries in other places have found it contrary to all of our stereotypes that people in other cultures have said, you eat your God? Wait a minute, why would you eat your God? That's very weird. So tell me how you process the notion of Holy Communion through the lens that you're using.
Well, a lot of this starts back in 1215 when Pope Innocent III basically said that the consecrated elements of the Eucharist were literally transformed into the body and blood of Christ. And this got a lot of people, I'm sure a lot of people thought this was really strange because Jesus had spoken and he had used symbolism before, I am the gate or I am the true vine, and I'm sure not many people thought that he was talking literally. But here was an instance where what seems to be a symbolic ritual was basically determined not to be, and up until this very day, in 1965, Pope Paul VI reconfirmed the fact that this was not a symbolic event, that you were literally during communion, you were literally consuming the body and blood of Jesus Christ, and anybody who believed that it was a symbolic event or ritual was not really a good Roman Catholic, for example.
Right. So, in this approach avoidance, I don't know if you can draw a direct line from one thing to the other, but, we get to the time of the Restoration. So there's kind of two things going on at the time of the Restoration. First of all, there's the beginning of the exploration of the so-called New World, and so tales are coming back of these horrible primitive tribes who do all kinds of things that they're not supposed to do, including perhaps acts of cannibalism. Isn't that awful? Look at those people in Brazil. Look what they're doing. And at the same time, in a way that is a little reminiscent of communion, there's this sudden interest in eating, shall we say, parts of the king. In the span of the Restoration, with the beheading of Charles I and the subsequent rise eventually of Charles II, there's this whole thing that goes on. Tell us about that thing.
Well, look, I think what you really have to do is go back and look at how, to me, the important thing was how cannibalism was, how the taboo that developed 2,000 years ago was really used as a bludgeon as explorers like Christopher Columbus came to the New World, saw these people, described them as innocent and worthy of becoming good Christians. Then when he couldn't find any gold, looked for another resource. That resource turned out to be humans. That Queen Isabella told them, look, if these people are not cannibals, you can't enslave them. But if they are, then you can do, all bets are off. You can do whatever you want. And this to me and the work that I did with this book really showed that an important result of the cannibalism taboo that we have in the West was the fact that that many people, starting in the Mediterranean, starting in the Caribbean rather, and then into Mexico, South America, Africa, used the term cannibalism as a way to differentiate, to delineate themselves from anyone else, any other group. And resistance and cannibalism became sort of synonymous terms. And that, to me, was the important thing. Whether people ate their kings and thought that was, that was really, in my book, secondary to really to what was happening to people across the world as this term and as this practice was whether they performed it or not was really used to destroy them.
Right. It's kind of shorthand, right? Rather than a detailed explanation of why it's going to be okay to enslave these people, ship them back here, separate them from their families, risk their health, expose them to diseases they have no immune system for, take all their stuff. You could go into a long chapter and verse about this. But if they're cannibals, well, case closed, right?
Right. Yeah, it's pestilence. You're not talking about humans. So you could hunt them, you could destroy their culture, you could enslave them, anything you want. But you could take their property, you could ultimately just completely destroy their culture, and it wouldn't matter because these were not human beings.
But meanwhile, just back to the Restoration briefly, there was this notion, particularly when somebody was beheaded, like Charles I, that if you could get some of the blood that came out right then, it had all kinds of medicinal values. And
and this to me was one of the most surprising things. When I wrote this book, well, first of all, I'm a zoologist, so I spent a lot of time working on looking at cannibalism across the animal kingdom, and I was surprised at how widespread it was for reasons that don't have anything to do with a lack of food or cramped captive conditions. But the real surprise when I started to work on human cannibalism was just how prevalent it was in Europe for hundreds of years as medicinal cannibalism. And as you mentioned, blood, just about any body part that you can envision, from the skeleton to viscera, liver, fat, was used in medical preparations for hundreds of years, starting in the Middle Ages, throughout the Renaissance, and lasting right up until 20th century. 1908, Merck Index had mumia, ground-up mummy, listed as a medicinal, having medicinal value. So that blew me away. Given the Western taboo, that was incredibly surprising to me.
Well, and I think. Yeah, I think obviously they'd have ways of differentiating and say, well, no, we're not doing it that way. We're doing it this way. It's really, it's a tincture.
Well, they did make it disappear. I mean, you don't read about that very much.
Well, and that's I wanted to wind up there too as we get ready for the next segment, which is, again, we have this sort of weird approach avoidance attitude towards this subject, and most people know about the Donner Party. This is 1846, a group of pioneers. They get caught up in a pass, and I mean, basically the story is that they did engage in survival cannibalism. I mean, what in general, I think when that happens among one's own people, the goal is to make it disappear, right? Or to say, oh, no, that didn't happen. Oh, like in China, they did that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
You're right. I mean, they try to incorporate themselves back into society as quickly as possible. And as far as the Donners went, not a lot of the survivors wrote anything about it. It came out of a couple of interviews, and there was very decent documentation that cannibalism happened at least in 4 different places with the Donners. Although over the last couple of years, the media threw a monkey wrench into that one by releasing some kind of bogus information that came out of a valid scientific study saying cannibalism didn't take place, and everybody was really ready to jump on that bandwagon and accept the fact that these good Christians weren't really cannibals.
Right, and I think the same thing is with Jamestown too. It's maybe not a story that people particularly relish if they want to cling to the notion of American exceptionalism. But the other side of that coin is that if you want to get something onto the evening news, if it has a cannibal angle, it goes to the top of the list, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And then, that happens with cannibalism in nature too. We've been dealing recently about this whole idea that global climate change has turned polar bears into cannibals, when that's not a reality. And the real story is more interesting than that. But that's not to say that the media forgot to mention that scientists have known for over 100 years that bears will eat their young whenever they can get a hold of them.
Right.
So they left that out because that wasn't the sexy part. The sexy part was, that cannibalism was taking place, and then they added that on to global climate change, and they had their story.
Right. So our final segment is going to be about an interview with somebody who was depicted in the media that way. But it's even the phrase that you just used. I know exactly what you mean by it, too. The cannibalism is the sexy part, that somehow or other there's a little bit more to this story if it involves cannibalism.
Oh, no doubt.
Yeah, but why would that be? I mean, in some ways, it's this thing we don't want to hear about. We don't want to hear about it, particularly in connection with nice Western, Judeo-Christian people just like us. But then we do suspect it somehow, or I don't know, we're titillated by it somehow, too.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think it's because it has become the ultimate taboo for a number of reasons. I had a chapter in my book used to be called Blame It on the Greeks. And because I wondered, where did this taboo come from? And if you look back, it probably started with Homer and Polyphemus, the Cyclops, and then moved to the Romans, and then William Shakespeare. To him, when you look at Titus Andronicus, the worst revenge that you can take on another person is to have them eat someone else, eat a loved one. And then moved to the Brothers Grimm and Daniel Defoe, and there was this snowball effect that took place that to the point where now, and the early anthropologists thought the same thing. James Fraser came out and said that cannibalism was prevalent all over the world, and then when the early anthropologists sort of followed him out into the field, that's what they expected to see. They expected to see cannibalism in all of these groups, whether it happened or not. And so now, 2,000 years later, when we hear the word cannibalism, we have this knee-jerk reaction. And I think a lot of it has to do with this sort of Judeo-Christian belief about the soul and the body being reunited on Judgment Day, and cannibalism implies that you're disarticulating and consuming the body, so that's not going to work down the road. And then we've always been picky about our food as well.
Right.
What people eat has always been used to delineate outsiders and foreigners from us.
Although, and we should say, it's not as though it doesn't happen, and sometimes it is connected to very comparable kinds of beliefs. I can't remember which New Guinea tribe gets kuru. Kuru is the disease.
The foray.
It's like Jakob Creutzfeldt syndrome, and you get that because you eat the brains of your deceased relatives, and the notion, I think, is you are somehow they're trying to preserve some aspect of them by eating their brains, right?
Yeah, this is a typical funerary rite that was developed in a group that did not come across those Western taboos, and it happened in New Guinea, and it happened, in South America, and in the Waray in Brazil, for example. They were just as mortified when they learned from anthropologists that the anthropologists would bury their dead. They were like, "How could you do that? How could you put your loved ones in the ground to rot and hang around and be eaten by worms? Why wouldn't you incorporate them into yourselves?" And so this is one type of cannibalism that I found to be extremely interesting, and it goes far beyond the knee-jerk reaction, lack of food or criminal cannibalism, which that had been done. A lot had been written about it, a lot of it sensationalized, and so I thought that there was sort of a space in between the sensationalized works that are out there and the academic works, and I went for the middle and tried to be entertaining, not use too much terminology, don't throw around a lot of scientific terms here. Keep the jargon to a minimum. Maybe make it entertaining and a bit humorous where possible. And I just found that there were so many interesting stories and so much about cannibalism that is just not generally known. And that was my book.
And that's your book, which is Cannibalism, A Perfectly Natural History. Bill Schutt has been our guest, a professor of biology at LIU Post, research associate of the American Museum of Natural History. Don't worry, you can bring the kids there. There's no cannibalism diorama. All right, so we're going to take a break. We're going to come back, and we're going to talk to somebody who was accused of plotting and fantasizing about cannibalism.
Because it's getting to the time that she will need to. Cannibal, she rips out my bones just like I'm an animal. And right when I'm feeling like
cannibal has so much baggage. Maybe if they changed the name to something like Anthro-tarian. Today's show was produced by Josh Nalea on A Bed of Kale and me, Kyone Wolf. Executive producer Katie Tolarski appeared in the intro, and Amanda Fish has served poached with Amanda Fish Rowe. The part of Bill Curry was played by Johnny Depp. Tomorrow, we're turning the show over to you. No guests, just open phone lines. And now, back to Colin.
So our final guest here today, and this is a show produced as only Josh Nalea can produce a show. Our final guest today is Gil Valley. Gil Valley, former New York City police officer who spent 21 months in prison before being exonerated and released. He's the co-author of Raw Deal, the untold story of NYPD's cannibal cop, as he was known in the press. We were just talking about how the press likes to go wild with stories that have a cannibal element. So, first of all, Gil Valley, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Colin, for having me. Thanks for the opportunity. Really appreciate it. And this is clearly a very comfortable afternoon drive subject.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, it's more familiar ground for you, and it's certainly you've been through the ringer on this. You were sentenced to prison. The verdict was eventually overturned, I think about 16 months after the original verdict. Right. A circuit court has since affirmed your acquittal in December of 2015. But maybe we should begin at the beginning. How did you get in this mess?
Well, I was a teenager. I hit puberty, and I mean, this is all kind of explained, and the whole evolution of all this is outlined in greater detail in the book. But long story short, I found myself to be sort of aroused by images and videos of women tied up, women in bondage. From there was a pornography website that catered to more cannibalism interests, and I started to incorporate the whole cannibal theme into the fantasies that I was having. Now, I never actually was into the actual eating of the person. It was more the woman tied up and being prepared for a feast or dinner or whatever. I was not really into the blood and gore stuff. Other people that I role-played with were, but I understand why the moniker stuck with me and continues to stick with me today.
So the problem was that you were on these online sites, these kind of dark web sites,
yes,
where people talk about this stuff. It appeared that you were talking about not only your generalized interest in things like that, but your specific interest in preparing, cooking, and maybe eating your then wife, and maybe some other women too. Now, why, if in fact you don't really want to do stuff like that, why would you be talking to other people about it?
Well, as you said, it was a fetish website. It was a fantasy website, and it's for people to explore sexual fantasies. The whole gamut of stuff on this website. Now, my fantasies are unusual. Admittedly, people say they're deviant, abnormal. That's fine. But sexual fantasies typically involve people that you know in your life. When someone has a fantasy, they think about the hot girl at work or in your class or someone in your life. So that part of the story isn't unusual, but that's what scared people, was the fact that the role plays and stories involved women that I knew in my life.
Right. So your problem was that the hot girl at work was 185 degrees.
Right.
And so, you did get, part of the problem for you at trial is that there were Google searches on how to prepare human meat, where to find huge cooking trays, how to cook a woman alive. Is that just, I don't know, one argument that I've seen, or one way I've seen you quoted is, in order to participate in these things and maybe even be a desirable participant in these fantasy, fetish, dark web sites, the more that you can kind of come up with details, the more interesting a conversational partner you are. Is that why you were looking up all this stuff?
Yeah, exactly. My role plays and stories, they started to get a little repetitive, and people enjoyed role playing with me because I focused on details, and I'm a good writer. The FBI thought that my stories were a real conspiracy, so I looked stuff up to sort of add new things to these stories, and I'm finding myself sort of doing it again. Since the first book, I'm taking a swing at a horror novel, and the things I'm researching are somewhat similar to the things I was researching back then, but now I'm doing it as part of a clearly fictional book. But it was no different from what I was doing back then because it was always all fiction. None of it was real. These were quote-unquote conspiratorial plans with screen names on the internet. These were anonymous people. I never knew who they were, where they were from. I never knew their names. There were never phone numbers exchanged. These were just people who I knew by their screen names. These were fictional plots that were supposed to be taking place in a mountain house in Pennsylvania with human-sized ovens, just all kinds of stuff that didn't exist.
Right. So, I mean, it's like, well, first of all, I just want to say if you're writing a novel, I hope you get to go to a writer's conference. I would recommend Bread Loaf under the circumstances.
I'll jot that down, okay.
Obviously, write what you know. So, look, I think you, even better than our previous guest, Bill Schutt, could tell people what it's like when the media gets hold of this. There was some way in which Cannibal Cop just attached itself to you with crazy glue, right? And do you have a theory about like why was this such a compelling story compared to all the other wacky stuff that goes on in the world?
Yeah, there's a lot of wacky stuff. There are police officers who get arrested. I don't want to say frequently, but it happens. But when my thing happened, the whole cannibal story really blew up, and the whole Cannibal Cop thing had sort of a ring to it. If the FBI waited a month, I would have been promoted to sergeant, and I would have been the cannibal sergeant, but I don't think that sounds as good. Anyway, that's a stupid joke, but...
No, alliteration, I get it.
Yeah. So, oddly enough, I was kind of shielded from everything when I was arrested because I was in solitary confinement. I didn't have access to anything. I didn't really grasp how big it was until I was let out of prison, and I eventually read all the stuff that was written about me. And I think it's just the sensational allegations. You know what I mean? I was this police officer who was going to abduct and cook women, and it just sort of blew up. And I think your previous guest hit on it. People hear the word cannibalism, and it's like a whole new ballgame.
Right. Gil, we have very little time left, but I do want to know, okay, so first of all, you're basically in the clear there now, although there was some thought that it could conceivably go to the Supreme Court. Have you received any assurances one way or the other about this?
The case is completely over. There's nothing
okay.
that's going to the Supreme Court. I'm completely exonerated, and I have a couple of lawsuits in now.
So what's life like? I mean, this isn't unless you're going to... you're doing a show like this one, you're writing books about it and everything. Yeah. You're not trying to make it go away. So, I don't know, you meet somebody new. What's that like?
It's complicated. When I was out of prison, I was worried, okay, I'm out, I'm free, but how am I going to be received in society? What am I going to do for work again? I couldn't go back to the police department, and my name is easily, people type my name into Google and boom, there you go, all kinds of articles. So it was difficult. There was a lot of misinformation still out there. People were making up their minds about me based on myths that were presented early on in the case, and an HBO documentary came out. It wasn't close to what I was promised, so I was sort of pushed to finally get my story out. And you're right. In writing the book, things sort of resurrected again, but they're resurrecting in a different way now. I think people now are focusing on the legal parts of this case. It's a very important legal case. When can someone be prosecuted for thoughts without actions? And I'm happy about that. Although things are hectic again, like you said, I'm doing these interviews, and it's sort of contrary to who I've always been. I've always been a private person, but once my family and my support system they told me they would be okay with it, I went with the book, and people have received it very well. It's impacting people the right way, and like I said, people are now starting to focus on the important legal questions, which is what I wanted. Those sort of got lost early on because of the whole sensational cannibalism, rhetoric about the case. But
I hear you.
Yeah.
Gil, we are flat out of time here, but Gil Valley, thank you so much for talking to us. Co-author of his own story, Raw Deal, the untold story of NYPD's Cannibal Cop. Thanks to all of you who made it all the way through this show. I realize it might have been tough sledding for some of you. And thanks to Josh and Leia for making the show happen. Thanks for Wolfie on the board, too. We'll be back tomorrow.
Thanks for coming to Hannibal's and have a great night. Oh, and how was your service?
Well, to be honest, our waiter wasn't very good. I mean, stew? Again?